Care podcast. And I am so excited that we are starting the new year here in 2024, still uncovering what has happened in the last couple years with COVID, with hospitalizations, and even a bigger and better topic, more dear to my heart, is the nurses. The nurses to me are so fundamental in this whole design of the healthcare system. I'm a background as a nurse. My original nursing for going into this was just to help people. And that's exactly what most nurses wanted to do. Even my grandmother, who was fought back in World War II as a lieutenant army nurse, this is so fundamental to me to uncover where were the nurses in this COVID pandemic? What were they doing in the hospitals? Because we hear several stories all over, and we just want to uncover exactly what happened so we don't have to relive this again. So here we are in election disease season, I call it. This almost feels like 2020 again because we are at the beginning of an election year. And I surely do not want to repeat 2020 with the shutdowns, with the lockdowns, with the protocols. What I want to do is I want to be proactive in my thinking to go, what can we do this year differently than what we did in 2020? We don't need to hide our eyes. We need to open them up to see what are the things that we can do, especially as nurses. What can we do to help our patients and advocate for them? So I have a great guest on today, Ken McCarthy. He wrote a book that I want him to unfold for us because this book, he just showed me it. It is humongous. What he put together is really investigates what was going on in the hospitals, and what the nurses were seeing was pretty powerful. So Ken, welcome to the Graith Care podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Yes. So tell me, what even got you? Are you a nurse? And after talking to nurses, you might think you're a nurse. We always said
Well,
that at the dinner
I'll tell you
table.
this. After talking to nurses, I have nurses, friends who are nurses, of course. I mean, something like 1 out of every 85 people in America is a nurse. Have you ever? I mean, it's because there's 5 million nurses, not all registered, but 5 million, and there's 300 million of us. There's a lot of nurses around, so I know nurses and I like nurses.
Don't mess with nurses, is what I say, because we are pretty powerful when we come together. But during this COVID, in the beginning in 2020, it threw the nurses that were really starting to question things versus the nurses that were like, oh no, we're just going to do what the doctor's saying. And some critical thinking went out the window. I can say this because I was advocating for people in outside of the hospitals to help them navigate the systems. And I was talking to nurses that were completely clueless to what was happening. So, what was some of the
Well,
things that led you to writing a book about what the nurses saw?
and let me say this, it wasn't just the nurses. There were a
Mm,
lot of clueless doctors. There were a lot of clueless respiratory therapists.
yes.
So let's not put this just on nurses. So why did I do this? Well, I saw the interviews way back in 2020 with Erin Marie, who I think everybody knows, and Nicole
Yeah.
Rotek, and I saw them, and I even interviewed Erin at length in June of 2020 because I thought this is a huge story what these nurses are saying. And I thought somebody, surely one of these great investigative journalists or one of these organizations that raises millions of dollars to, fight for medical freedom, surely somebody is going to talk to these nurses and talk and see if there's more than one. And 2020 went by, 2021 went by, 2022 went by. It's halfway through 2023, and I realized nobody's going to tell this story. So I went out and I found as many nurses as I could find and fit in the book. And here's what the book looks like. And here's how thick the book is. So at a
Nurses
certain
have
point,
a lot to say if you
I
actually listen
do.
to the nurses.
I tell you, I mean, here's something really interesting. And the average person will get this wrong. Who, on the average, who has more clinical experience, an MD or a nurse? Now we're talking about, experienced nurses, not someone just out of school. Who has a greater clinical sense of what's going on with the case in general?
Well, the nurses always do because we're at the bedside. We listen to the family. We're seeing the patient on our 12-hour shifts. We hold our bladder because we can't pee because we're too busy running from room to room. And when you say that you were wondering who was going to actually listen to the nurses. Most nurses at the bedside are ignored by administrative people and even doctors or even their management. They're not listened to because we see the gaps. This has been going on for decades
Right.
of the nurses not being listened to. So I think COVID just really exposed what was really happening.
Yeah, it came to a crescendo. I mean, everything that was already broken and bad got 100 times worse. And today I was just thinking about this, and I'd be interested in your opinion. We have this weird hierarchy in medicine. It starts with the federal bureaucrats. They're God. Whatever they say goes. And then underneath that, you have the medical researchers who are all indebted to the federal bureaucrats. And we saw a lot of distortion of science going on during COVID, a lot. Then underneath that, that trickles down to the MDs, the doctors. And then at the lowest rung of this hierarchy are the nurses. And so you had the federal bureaucrats commissioning to get the research they wanted. They created these bizarre and unprecedented and frankly deadly protocols, which they then enforced through the state health departments, through the hospitals. That was passed on to the doctors, and then the doctors instructed the nurses, do this, do that. The whole thing is backwards. The federal bureaucrats should be the least important people, right?
Yeah.
The researchers, I think, are important, but they shouldn't be in bed with the federal bureaucrats. They should be doing real science. They shouldn't go off and create, because there's been a lot of fraud. That could be a whole nother book. All of the fraudulent COVID science.
Fraud, waste, and abuse. Think about that in the healthcare system. That happens so much.
Yeah, and it's particularly distressing because I'm not a scientist. I don't make it my living as a scientist, but I was trained in science, and it's particularly distressing to hear and to see how much science was literally perverted. I don't know any other word to use for a buck. Fauci needed, and I wrote another book called Fauci's First Fraud. Fauci needed a certain set of conclusions, so he just wrote checks, and the guys getting those checks knew we better come up with conclusions that Dr. Fauci, well, is he a doctor? I mean, he's got an MD. Does that make him a doctor? All right.
I don't think he's quite seen a patient actually eye to eye. He pushes the agenda, and we know what they do with those medications, such as remdesivir, and it's still being used today. In this book
Yep.
about talking about nurses, with you not being a nurse, I'm interested in understanding what was some of the things that popped out to you as you were putting this book together. What made you maybe fearful or surprise you? Is there anything that you would want to
So,
talk about?
so many things, so many things. I'll just say this: my son, because I have a formal science training, I'm not intimidated by any language or any science or any, you can't scare me with complicated words, right?
Mhm.
So I'm able to read this stuff and understand it. I'll tell you some amazing things that shocked me. Um, they banned, if you were diagnosed as a COVID patient in a hospital, you were not allowed to get ibuprofen. That blew at least this was the report of many nurses. That blew my mind. I mean, we know about ivermectin and vitamin D and vitamin C, and somehow that became controversial. And, I get it. That got swept away by the controversy, unfortunately, a fake controversy, but
Mhm.
it got swept away. But ibuprofen? Since when do you not give ibuprofen for inflammation? So the fact that they banned this go-to, completely accepted, widely used, simple, relatively safe. I mean, no drug is ever 100% safe, but it's safe enough that they banned ibuprofen. It's really bad. And then there's a steroid treatment. Unfortunately, I don't have the technical name in mind, but there's a specific steroid that is used for lung distress when someone's in lung distress, and it's very successful in knocking down inflammation. Again,
Are
not
you talking
controversial.
about Pulmicort or Bumescidide?
There's a bunch of them, right? And
Mhm.
and 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 this is not controversial. This is not new. This is established science. This is actually standard of care,
Mhm.
right? But if you were diagnosed as a COVID patient, that you couldn't get that treatment. I'm
Yeah,
like,
things changed.
yeah, what the heck? What the heck? The next thing that I think is really concerning is the use of the BiPAP. They went straight to that. All right. Now, cannula would be the first thing you'd go to, right? You wouldn't immediately slap a BiPAP thing on somebody's face. I'm also, even though I'm not a nurse or a doctor, I'm a practical person and I've built lots of things and I know how to go to from A to Z in a process. So the idea that they slap this BiPAP on people, and then the cruelest thing was not to tell them, look, this thing's not comfortable. It's like sticking your head out the window when you're going 60 miles an hour. But we're here, and let us know how you're feeling, and we'll be with you. They didn't do that. They
Mhm.
just slapped this thing on people's faces and left them.
So you're
Then they
saying
would,
the nurses you talked to, what they were telling you is that they were skipping a nasal gastric tube, which is a normal oxygen in the nose, and they
yeah,
were just automatically skipping that and going to the BiPAP that covered their nose and mouth. Is that what you were
this
hearing?
became this became the protocol,
Okay.
you know, and um, and then not spending time with the patient and preparing them and saying, this isn't going to be comfortable. This is
Yeah.
going to be tough, but we're
They left
here.
them alone.
Yeah. And they left this was a theme. COVID was supposedly so transmissible and so fatal. If you even looked at somebody from across the street, they'd catch COVID and die. And so they put this nonsense into people's heads and use that as the justification for not providing basic care for patients. And by the way, almost every nurse said of all the atrocities they saw, and they saw many atrocities, they are almost universal in their statement that the greatest atrocity was not providing care, being with the patient, talking with the patient, checking the patient. Bizarre thing. So now they've got the BiPAP on somebody and they're becoming anxious. And that gets written down as agitated. And now, once they're agitated, now the whole pharmacopoeia of psychoactive drugs, sedatives comes into play. And so a lot of these patients were being offered, hey, you seem a little distressed. Would you like something to help you relax? Now they've started them on a train of sedatives and psychoactive substances, which some people don't react very well to. I mean, if you don't have it's not guaranteed that when you take a sedative, it's going to go well. Could go
Right.
very badly. So now they're distressed because they've been told they've got a fatal disease that's going to kill them. This thing has been put on they haven't been given any care, no anti-inflammatories, no steroids. Get the BiPAP. They don't know what it is. It's uncomfortable. They're reacting normally. Now they're being given drugs that are maybe destabilizing their sense of reality. And then out comes the remdesivir. Hey, we've
Yeah.
got this great cure for our treatment for COVID.
Yeah. Did they
And
talk about the patients being given information as to remdesivir
we
to the
heard
patients
I mean, all
family?
kind. There's a bunch of things. One, there was coercion.
Okay.
You got to do this, you're going to die. That became the theme. You're not
Okay.
doing
Yep.
the theme became you're not doing very well. You need this. But there were cases reported in the book where patients were told, "Oh, it's not remdesivir. And I forget what the actual,
Veklury.
yeah. Oh, it's not that. It's Veklury. Oh, okay. Because a lot
It's
of
the
patients
same drug.
the same drug.
It's the same drug with just a new branding, the other name for it. And this is the confusion that I'm frustrated with as a nurse now that I do patient advocacy work, is the fact that there is not good information being given to the patient and families. And this is where gaps happen. And then you have patients dying alone. And that to me was very horrible, to have this isolation happening where people were dying alone, or they would be on like a FaceTime or something like that, watching their family member die.
Yeah, well, if possible, it gets even worse than that. One of the reports from one of the hospitals was that uh, patients that were, maybe they were already sick with multiple preconditions,
Right.
and this just hit them. This and all the excessive and unhinged over treatment put them even closer to death, and they were denied contact with their families, and they were told if you will submit to, they gave it some, cotton candy kind of name, palliative, not palliative care, but
It's
another.
palliative care probably, or
But they,
comfort
they
care.
they use the comfort care. This hospital used the term comfort care,
Yeah.
which means we're going to give you a fatal course of opioids and
Hmm.
kill you. And if they agreed to that, they were allowed to meet with one of their family members.
Yeah,
That was the
so kind,
condition.
isn't it?
I mean, the cruelty of that is, I mean,
Yeah.
it's mind-boggling. So this was one of the things going on. But going back to remdesivir, they were coerced into taking it in some cases. They were deceived into taking it. And we also have reports in this book they were given remdesivir when they were unconscious and did not give consent.
Mm-hmm.
So that went on as well. And the remdesivir story, it should be a book in itself. I mean, it was developed by Gilead. It was developed for Ebola. We kept hearing that Ebola
A
caused
failed, it was failed
it
for
failed.
Ebola.
But there's another twist to this. I don't know if you remember, but we were constant because I paid a lot of attention to medical issues. I mean, I'm just into it, for decades. I mean, and I've been an advocate in my writing against things like giving kids Adderall. I mean, I've been in this for a long time, so I pay attention to everything. But I remember the Ebola thing. They kept saying, "Well, Ebola causes organs to fail and explode and all this." And I'm like, "Wow, that's a pretty bad disease." Is
Yeah.
it possible it was the remdesivir that was causing that? I don't know. This is for someone else to look into. But Gilead created this thing. It failed, and suddenly in early April, Fauci, with I think 6 weeks of testing, determined that it was the only cure for COVID.
Yep.
Um, Very
And I
strange.
believe he said that in the White House with Trump,
Oh yeah.
and it was very public. And that to me highlighted questions going, how could this be? And what ties does he have to Gilead? And where's the money? Because the money to me always kind of tells me why things are actually happening. Some of these things that were being given wasn't for care, it was for money.
Well, absolutely. And that we have the video of that on our website. We have a website called What the Nurses Saw, and we have the actual because I remember that press conference
I
and I'm
do
like,
too.
he's sitting in the Oval Office talking about how a drug that's never been proven for COVID is the ultimate cure. What's going on here?
Yep.
Um, but one thing we know about Gilead makes a whole range of drugs that supposedly treat HIV.
Yep.
A lot of them. One of them is this really sinister drug called Truvada. And they have conned a generation of young people into thinking that Truvada is a prophylactic against AIDS. I'll just call fraud on that right now. I don't need to be a PhD to see through that nonsense. And what they've told these young people is, well, look, you're gay, you're going to, that makes you high at risk for AIDS, so you should get on Truvada for the rest of your life. And
Yeah.
Gilead makes that. And somewhere in another book I wrote, the one on Fauci's first fraud, I think Gilead pays the NIH $28 million a year in royalties on Truvada. I couldn't get the
None
royalty.
of that should be happening. None of that
Oh
should be
yeah,
happening. The
crazy.
bureaucrats should not have anything to do with our healthcare system at all. It is so tasteless and it's deadly.
Yep. So we know that just one of Gilead's drugs is putting $28 million into the pocket of the NIH. Now, your listeners may or may not know that there are actually individual employees at NIH who sometimes are eligible to receive a portion of those royalties. Gilead has a stack of HIV drugs that it's marketing. And I don't know how many of them I don't know how many are paying commissions to NIH. And I don't know how many of those commissions are ending up in Fauci's pocket. And we still don't know that answer because he refused to answer it in a congressional hearing. But that's the remdesivir piece. Then, when people were failing, the BiPAP was not, was agitating them. They were given remdesivir. They're not doing well. They came in distress to begin with. Then the line from the doctors was, "You're not doing too well. I think we need to intubate and vent you."
Before that, did they ever talk about the drug Precedex?
Never came up in any of the interviews I did.
Interesting. Okay, because we saw a trend with all of the clients that came to us for help, and Precedex oftentimes was put on while they were on BiPAP, and a couple things would happen with Precedex. It would lower the respirations and it would lower the heart rate. And then they would go, oh, you're failing, you're not doing so good. We need to then intubate you. Well, Precedex, we believe, was a precursor to this because it does have those adverse effects. But one of the side effects or adverse reactions of Precedex, this is an IV medication that goes through a line. One of the key adverse reactions, it creates more agitation. Well, if you're a patient that is in respiratory distress, why do you want to create more agitation? they're going to fail, hence leading to intubation, which then we tie back and go, okay, what was the protocol giving to these hospitals for these intubations as well?
Gotcha. Well, I don't remember Precedex, but I do remember many of the nurses saying that the drugs given to supposedly sedate and calm the patients
It's
down
Precedex.
is Precedex. Okay.
I
And
bet you if you go back to those nurses, ask them about the medication Precedex, I almost guarantee that you're going to hear it a resounding, because they were using it all over from coast to coast. And
wow. And
this was a medication. And I use Precedex when I was at the bedside. So I'm not opposed to medications being used. What I'm opposed to is that it wasn't being used appropriately. And in my opinion, and it was creating more of an issue. Therefore, these patients were being intubated too early, not doing the right treatments proactively. So
yeah.
therefore, once you got intubated, the mortality rate went way high.
Well, this is, I mean, this thing has so many dimensions. Let's talk about intubation first. Well, actually, let's talk about Precedex and drugs like it and other sedatives, right? People think, well, physiology. You breathe because you have a diaphragm. It's a very unglamorous organ in our body, but it's a muscle. It's a muscle, it's flesh, it's a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
That's why you breathe. The minute that diaphragm stops moving or starts being sluggish, you're going to be gasping for air and you're going to be dead soon, right? So many of these drugs that they were giving, Precedex being one of them, has as an adverse reaction respiratory difficulty. Where's that respiratory difficulty coming from? Well, if you completely relax the body, you're also probably going to relax the diaphragm. So they, as you were saying, they were really setting people up to quote, need intubation. Now let's talk about intubation and venting. One of our experts that we interviewed is a respiratory therapist. And that's the person that intubates patients and manages patients while they're while they're on a vent. And that is a very serious, complicated profession. It's a 4-year training. There's nothing trivial about it. If people,
Yeah.
your audience is largely nurses.
We have a respiratory therapist as a part of our team.
Oh,
And
good.
and it's amazing when see, that's the team collaboration. The doctors, respiratory therapist, nurse, the charge nurse, the housekeeper, everybody should be on the same page in terms of how are we going to take care of this person in the bed to give them early treatment and cause less risk to them
Gotcha.
based off of whatever comorbidities. Respiratory therapists, I've worked with some of the best of the best. They are fantastic.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And this should be said before we go on any further. When things work normally, it is a team. And if somebody notices, hey, something's off here, this medication, this patient's reacting really, we just gave him this thing and he's going down. Well, normally the doctor, everybody would pay attention. In this climate of coercion, this iron fist coercion, this is probably the most important takeaways from the book. Nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, if they expressed their normal concern, which is their job, they were shut down.
So they were advocating.
They were advocating, exactly.
And then they got shut down because they were questioning the treatment or what to do next for the patient.
Exactly. One nurse who had a lot of experience in super emergency medicine and actually was trained in intubation because she works in remote places where you just don't have anybody else.
Yep.
She was punished for refusing to give remdesivir, and they took her out of the ICU and just put her in like this holding pen with a bunch of other nurses that had nothing to do. And then they finally fired her. So when we talk about shutting the nurses down, we're talking about not listening to them, demoting them or moving them out of the ICU, firing them, and then blackballing. Some of the nurses were blackballed. They were fired from one place and they couldn't get employed elsewhere. There was a great respiratory therapist who we used in the book. 23 years, stellar experience, stellar track record, beloved by all. He questioned some things. He was walked out by security, and he couldn't get a job anywhere in his region because he had been formally blackballed. This at a time when respiratory therapists were in very short supply. We have I'm looking at the clock because I know we have a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
I want to leave this thing, maybe this last piece. intubation and venting is the last resort. If somebody is in a, let's say a catastrophic accident and their diaphragm's just not moving, you've got to breathe for them, right? Or if somebody, has some kind of, really, really serious thing. It's a treatment of last resort. And they were flipping it and trying to put as many people on vents as possible.
Right.
They completely against all previous medical practice, right? This was experimental. This was unproven. This has had no scientific basis in it, but they were doing it. They were trying to get as many people on vents as possible. Being on a vent is a very bad situation because they have to paralyze you, right? You have all these paralytic drugs, which come from an IV. It's not like a pill and you fall asleep. You're on constant drips,
Yeah.
paralytics, analgesics, including fentanyl, things to keep you knocked out. You're essentially under anesthesia. But, in an operation, you're under anesthesia, you come out a couple hours later. People would be on these vents for days, for weeks, for months.
Weeks.
Normally, from what we got from our expert in the book, as soon as you vent somebody, the very next 24 hours later, you test and you see, can I get this person off the vent? Because they're immobile, their bodies are being flushed with all kinds of, really powerful drugs, right? They're not moving, they're being nourished by the equivalent of sugar water. They have a feeding tube. It's not the most nutritious thing in the world. They're not getting hot, they're not getting hydrated. I mean, this is a recipe for killing somebody. So that's why it's the last resort. If we've exhausted all other possibilities, okay, we're now going to do this extreme thing. Venting was pushed from day one to get everybody on a vent. Why? They got paid if they put somebody on a vent. And I've learned this sinister thing in the book, which in the process of researching the book, which blew my mind. They got a bonus if they kept somebody on a vent for 96 hours and 1 second.
Mhm.
Okay,
That's
that completely against how you would normally do this. You
Yeah,
want to,
see,
if
that's
you
why
have,
we don't want bureaucratics and administrative people making decisions on care. We need care to be a collaboration from the doctors and nurses and the patient and family. It should be an interdisciplinary team approach. That is what we have lost in our healthcare system. It's become data oriented and protocol driven. And I would encourage everybody to get Ken McCarthy's book. I would like you to put that book up again so they can see it. What the nurses saw. And we hear this every single day. This is why so many nurses actually became advocates for Graith care, is because they felt like they weren't being listened to. They felt like there were so many gaps in care and they couldn't even stand up for their patients because the system was too bureaucratic for them and it wasn't actually addressing patient care needs and the holistic body. So Ken, what you're seeing, we've heard, and I'm glad this isn't a book that somebody actually took the time to write. That is a huge book. And I love nurses. I think that if all of us nurses came together, boy, do I think something like this would ever happen again? No. Because when you combine all of those nurses together and we start fighting for patient rights, patient options, the right to try, things change. But that didn't happen. And we need to remember what was happening in 2020, 2021, 2022, and it's still happening today, Ken. And we hear
well,
these stories all the time still, and patients are not being given all of their options and they're not being informed in many circumstances. I'm not saying all, but I'm saying there are quite a few circumstances and places that you do not want to get caught up in.
yeah, the system is still in place. They can do it. They could flip a switch and do exactly. And by the way, let's get some numbers to this. And I'm watching the time.
Yep.
Over 1 million people are reported to have died from COVID in the United States. 92% of them died while they were in a hospital. This means that we may not be talking about a few thousand people. We may be talking about hundreds of thousands of people that died as a result of these protocols. And nurses are our last line of defense. Absolutely. I'm a strategist, I'm a war fighter, and I'm looking at this, and the nurses are the last line of defense in this battle. So we all need to support our nurses, and
That's right.
we have to understand and support our nurses and what they've been going through pre-COVID, and how they are the last line of defense for you at the bedside, but also for this entire medical system.
Yep. Well, I can tell you, attest to that as a nurse. I will tell you that sometimes we're not quite listened to. And I think if all the nurses really came in that one voice together to say, you know what, patients should have all the options, right, to make an informed decision. But if they're not even given all of their options to begin with, how can they actually know what to do, risk versus benefit? So I'm thankful you wrote this book about nurses. I think that there's more stories to uncover. I know today there are so many people grieving during this holiday season that had lost their loved one to a COVID hospitalization that they didn't even get to be with them. And I am praying for those people. My heart breaks that nobody should ever die alone, and nobody should ever be treated in some of these circumstances that were absolutely horrendous. And I'm glad you brought this all out in writing because it needed to be done. And I'm excited for when you do a next book as well, because I think there can be more uncovered as well, like we talked about previously. So I appreciate you. Ken, any last words you'd like to share? And
Just
how do people follow you and so
oh,
forth?
just I would say get the book, and then you'll know how to follow me.
Okay. Okay. All right. That sounds good. Well, thank you so much for joining with me today as a special guest. And we will stay connected, and we're going to continue to let the nurses share their voices. And we appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.